Welcome, welcome, welcome. So as we had promised, we're going to continue the discussion that we have had, my brother and I, Anthony, in reference to our language as one of the identifiers of our culture. And we're going to take a slightly different tack tonight. We're going to be talking a little bit more about how we juxtapose the patois with quote-unquote standard English, how it is learned, how it is taught, how it is delivered, how we function with the language, and some of the other social considerations, social, political, cultural considerations that the language has for us as a people. First off, I'm going to declare ignorance. My knowledge of how language is taught and delivered can be filled in a timble and room left over for 2 mangoes and 3 on a banana. I have absolutely no understanding as to how teaching is done, how to deliver, how to teach material, any kind of material. Never was able to do it. I know some simple definitions from the English language. I know antonyms, I know synonyms, similar, simile, facsimile, metaphor, personification, nouns, pronouns, verbs.
Off the language.
Yes, I know off the language. I can read, I can comprehend, I can compose a sentence here and there, I can write to a composition, I can read a book, but I have no idea how that is imparted. So young folks who's first coming into learning the language can understand it. And as we go through our lives, how we can use it to make our lives that much more productive. So I leave that up to the experts, and we have one right here next to me this evening, my brother Anthony Perry. And from here, move forward, my brother.
Well, you open up a whole floodgate of things, and much of them I don't know, I know anything about. So let me just caution you.
Yes.
To say that this business of language learning, or what we call language acquisition and language use, is as fluid and as dynamic as anything else that we will ever know. Because this conversation, never several decades, will be quite redundant, actually, if we know anything about how we've come to know language and how we use it. But this business about English language learning, is not by accident. And I think I alluded to it in previous conversations. The very fact that we were enslaved and colonized, and we are still grappling with this notion of who should speak what, to whom, how, where, and how, is a continuous debate.
Yes, indeed.
And I just want to the colonial office. I don't know if you know anything about that. If you know anything about colonialism and imperialism, and in 1847, in fact, we're talking about 277 years ago, had this notion that in order for you to be civilized, you had to know English.
Period.
Let's fast forward. We have an English language policy that was drafted in about 1998 that was never taken off in Jamaica as a matter of legislative policy. And over these 277 or almost 280 years, we have been talking about this business about English language use and who should learn it, how they should learn it, where they should learn it. In a social context, Paul, where the vast majority of our Jamaican children hear a slightly different language at home than the one they come to school to hear and to learn. And that is precisely one of the biggest challenges that have been facing our country. People say they're near languages. The two languages are almost the same. If you talk to some of my colleagues in language education, if you talk to my colleagues in linguistics, they will tell you that there are similarities in syntax, there's some closeness in vocabulary, but in some cases, they are distinctly different languages. The other issue that I'd like to just raise, is that UNESCO, CARICOM, the University of the West Indies have come up with many different explanations and policies regarding English language. And I was thinking about it tonight, and I said, I don't think there's any other subject that has ever been decreed a policy than English. I've never heard about a mathematics policy. I don't know 1 and 1 make 2, and 2 times 3 is what?
5.
6, me never know. As you realize, I'm not about math.
You hesitated there for a moment to
No,
multiply 2 times 3.
exactly. I
So
don't
come
know if it's
on,
5
man.
or I don't know if it's 5 or it's 6. And let me just put something in context here. The University of West Indies was started as a university college of the West Indies, right? And the first, what it was, 38 students who started UWI, started out as medical doctors. When the college started to expand, most of the teachers came from England. And over the years, up until the 1990s, I believe, there was something called use of English, that every UWI student, whether they came from Barbados, because remember, Mona was the only campus, and I've made this argument to many of my colleagues who argue that the students don't know any English coming to UWI in 2024. And I said, be careful, because the English men, primarily men, came to the Caribbean and said, you don't know any English, and therefore you must go learn use of English. And there are many of my colleagues who can tell you the distresses they faced doing use of English. But you know what has happened, Paul? I hope some of them are not hearing me tonight, because they're sure going to get my throat. Some of the same victims of the use of English, imprisonment that they were put through at UWI, are doing the very same thing now to the students. And I want to some of us, we'll just say it in a very general way. UWI moved away from use of English to a set of courses called English for Academic Purposes. And I'm making this quite distinct because you and I know that the language in IT, which you're familiar with, is not the same language in biology and zoology and chemistry and mathematics and the social sciences. And all of them have their own language. They have their own way of writing. And I think I alluded to another reality in law, for example, where there's something called legal writing. It is not the same way as writing a piece of literary critique.
And in engineering,
and so
it's called
even
writing.
Even the students who come into higher education having top grades in CSEC and CAPE communication, CSEC English,
yeah,
and you get a grade 1, you're the creme de la creme, or you get CAPE Unit 1 in communication studies, are confounded when they have to write an essay in economics. Because remember now, there are different rhetorical skills, and the jargon of economics is not the same as the language used in the pure and applied sciences. And I want to make that absolutely clear. Fast forward a little bit more. Just quite recently, we introduced something called a foreign language policy. And the policy at UWI says that every student who comes into UWI should, if they didn't have it before they come in, acquire another language other than their mother tongue. I mean, needless to tell you, it created quite a firestorm. In fact, some people argue, why you even want to do that when the students can't manage English? And what I say, Paul, not knowing English does not prevent you from doing another language. English is not a prerequisite to learn any other language, as I said to colleagues. And I'm going to go all over the place, so even if I not make sense tonight, because I feel so passionate about it. Right. I remember being in Canada, and a student from East Asia came in to sign up for French, French and
Yes.
English are
Yes,
the
yes.
two official languages of Canada. And one of my colleagues in the language unit at University of Toronto said, Anthony, you heard that student she wants to do French, but she can't even speak English. I said, what are you talking about? I did not know that to learn another language, you
That's
have
a
to
prerequisite.
learn English.
Yes.
The two languages do not connect in that way. And I'm making this point because English language has been at the forefront of teaching and learning. And let's be clear here, because if a student walks into your primary school unable to speak in standard Jamaican English, it does not really matter or understand it. Because remember, there's the spoken and the written.
Written. Mhm.
And if you think the spoken is challenging for some of us, the written part is even more.
Yes.
Okay? So they come into the school hearing the language at home. And I'm saying this primarily because the children of rural Jamaica and parts of urban Jamaica in Kingston, for example, have different language competencies. Many of us, and we also spoke about this, many of us who have had a certain kind of education, we can flip between the two languages with with a lot of ease.
Yes.
So depending on where we are and who our audience is, you, Paul
Yeah.
Perry, it can be quite erudite. Certainly when you're in another context,
Right.
your English, as we would say, disintegrates or fades away, or you do the code switching. And I'm not talking about speaking with an American accent.
Right, right.
What I'm saying here, Paul, is that over the years, since emancipation to today, in 2024, we are still having this conversation about whose language and how it should be taught.
Yes.
There are some of the language educators, we believe that many of our students come to school, who start primary school, come and hear a different language than the one they would normally hear at home. And so it takes them a little time. But sometimes teachers are of the assumption that when they speak, the students understand standard Jamaican English. And while I'm not putting down any of our outstanding teachers, even teachers have struggles with the language. Even where you place emphasis in a word, pronunciation of word, when it's produce, produce, when is it produce? When is it product from product? Those kinds of subtle variations in pronunciation and enunciation is what is distressing for many, many students. But it can be said that non-native speakers of English, they have challenges in a primarily English-speaking classroom. And the argument, and we hear it, it's been proposed at UWI, is that probably English should be taught as a second language by whatever means, because there is bilingualism in our classrooms, even as we speak, okay, all across Jamaica. The other thing I want to point out too is that English is a subject that's used to sort out students. English and math
Yes.
is a kind of sorting out of our students. And the research shows us, Paul, that in rural, all age, and some of our secondary schools, the primary language is Jamaican Creole. There is a school of eminence, and this is where Jamaica's education system becomes extremely tiered. There's a particular prominent school, and I won't tell you the place where it is, but by the time I describe, you can probably tell, where 98% of the students in that school normally gets between grade 1 and 2 in CSEC English. Literally across the street is a junior high school, Remember, some of these students in the junior high school did not get the passing grade at PEP to get into what we consider to be the traditional
Elite high
high
school.
schools.
Mhm.
So what we're seeing here is what we call a segregation of our pupils according to their performance in the primary and the preparatory schools. What is even more interesting, Paul, and some of my colleagues in language education and Dr. Haslin Evans, one of the foremost educator, spoke to the performance of boys and girls in our primary and secondary schools. Boys and girls are almost equal in terms of their performance up to grades 5 and 6, but something happens by the time they hit between grade 7 and grade 9, and the girls tend to outperform. Some argue that the ways of teaching boys should be different from the way they teach girls. And my feminist colleagues will argue that boys take different life risks and chances than girls. But not only that, there's another concern about how our boys use English.
Interesting.
In some schools, some boys
Yes.
refuse to speak in standard English because it is a put down.
Yes.
If you're galang bad and talk chaka chaka,
Yeah.
masculinity
Goes through the window.
Testosterone, all of that has to be exemplified.
Yes, sir.
In the classroom and on the playfield.
And in your socialization.
And in your social life, that is how we see English.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But let us not we need to understand very, very clearly that this language and education is deliberate, because as we have come to know that standard Jamaican English is used across the professions. It's used in business, it's used in parliament, it's used in sports, and it's used in entertainment, but in varying degrees.
Yes, indeed.
In varying degrees.
And with that,
okay?
with that, my brother, here's the interesting point I want to make. What has happened tonight, you have touched some areas that is going to make this podcast, this discussion, move into a whole different realm as to how we laugh and we get jocular about patois and the juxtaposing in English and the community work and the market woman versus the high school teacher or the bank worker and so on. But how the whole umbrella of the language, the effect it has on our community, on our society, on our world, how we see how it influences not just in our immediacy, but beyond our grasp. Sometimes we don't understand how people view us just by virtue of, because the important point you made a while ago about how boys, especially when they come into the public space, how it is important that they not speak English, because it kind of removes their masculinity and so on and so forth. And it's not, it's not cool, right? While girls will proceed to speak quote unquote standard English, which in turn moves them into society at a different level. So with that, I want to stick a pin because I'd like to figure out a way how we can move the discussion and make this become a regular part of what we are doing. Because the stories that I want to tell, the cultural influences of our people growing up in rural Jamaica and so on, I think it has actually morphed into something a little bit more interesting when we talk about the language. Because I don't know music, I don't know dance, I don't know poetry, I don't know art, but I have found someone who we can discuss something that is I can do a little writing, I can do a little composition, I can speak in public places and so on. But the perspective that you have brought to the table makes that a little bit more, interesting.
And I want to emphasize this point because English has been used as a sorting out.
Yes, man. Yes.
It has been used as a sorting out of our children, and it starts very early.
Yes, and what I want to hold on to that point because I like for you to expound that. I like for you to expand on that notion the next time we talk. All right, my brother? Because we need to understand that because the leaders of our country, they're not dropped from the sky. So the youths, remember now we live in the Jamaican society is primarily a male dominated, well, the world in general. But you have to also understand that when you look at, say, for example, businesses in Jamaica, corporate Jamaica, a higher percentage over the last 10, 15, 20 years have been headed by women. Less men, because of the old school, have to move out because they have gotten older, they have died and so on. But a lot of younger women have empowered themselves with education. And a big part of the educational process is how they have understood and mastered.
I don't want us to leave tonight, though, with a very important point, because the Jamaica up to independence,
yes,
and the Jamaica up to the early 1970s, as far as access to secondary and higher education,
right,
distinctly different.
yes,
They remember this, what we call the expansion of what we call their comprehensive high schools, their new secondary schools. Remember, Paul, I made a point already that up until the 1970s, mid-1970s, the vast majority of our children left school at age 15.
Yes, interesting.
The expansion of secondary school gave greater access to more and more children of the working poor. And if you make the association, fewer of them were able to, quote unquote, display competencies in the use of English.
Yes.
So we still call today traditional high schools, and we talk about non-traditional high schools.
Yes.
And if we had the time, I could go across this entire length and breadth of Jamaica and count the schools that were grammar schools up to the 1970s. If you go back to our own parish, there were only two quote-unquote grammar schools, Happy Grove and Titchfield.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but even today, there are only four.
Yeah.
There's Buff Bay High and there's Fair Prospect High. And if we were to ask ourselves, and as I learned,
Port Antonio 5.
And Port Antonio High.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a private high school in Port Antonio. So there are in fact 5 high schools in Portland. But if you were to do a socio-economic, a demographic assessment of the students who go to Titchfield as against those who go to Happy Grove, both Buff Bay High and Port Antonio High, it tells us something about performance of both boys and girls and the background of the students who go into those schools. And you could use that indicator or those indicators right and across the length and breadth of Jamaica. But I want to make the point because access to higher education, access to secondary education took an exponential growth in the 1970s, which meant that more and more children whose first language and not necessarily standard Jamaican English were able to complete 5-year education program. Please let me know, let our listeners know that the school system has extended to 7 years.
Yes.
Every student in our secondary schools must go on to a grades 12 and 13 in some interesting permutations of that.
Yes.
And that we can continue at some other time. But I want to make the point with the connection between English language and access to and success at secondary school and beyond. Because the same concerns people have at the secondary schools, we're seeing it at the university level. And people are saying, well, where were these students? You can't have a doctor who can't write in English. And so it continues. And I am not for one thing diminishing the importance of English. But Paul, if you and I were to read some research papers in medicine, we could well have been reading another language. If I were to read some research papers in science and tech, I could have learned another language because these are languages unto themselves.
Yes.
But anyway, I don't want to get all worked up out of this, but I cannot not separate out the issue that English and access to education and performance in our schools, because even as we speak, Paul, we are hearing about underperformance in literacy. and the reading levels in our primary schools, it has shown incremental growth since the 1970s up to 1990s. And we talk about the UNESCO goals, the 2030 sustainable goals and education and equality and all of those nice platitudes about what we're able to do. And so is suggested. Yeah?
Yes.
But Paul, I find the conversation about education is important because almost all societies have been judged and measured by the quality of their education. And the question is, it's not even so much what degree you have, or what the grade you have, is what kind of transformational issue you're going to bring to the society. We could always talk about how many grades you have.
For nation building.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we must.
Yeah.
So we
Paul,
must at this time. Go ahead.
Question. Let me end by saying, I take umbrage with anybody who tells me if you don't know English, you can't succeed in the world. Tell that too. You might want to disparage entertainers or some sports people, but that's not what they are paid for. They're not paid to be articulate in English. They are paid for their skills and their skills at entertainment. You might not like what they sing about. Tough potato. But the reality is that English is not. And again, Paul, sorry to drag this out. The very language of some of us are so ashamed of. People come here to learn this Jamaican. And I go back to the example of the Bob Marley. There are no subtitles, but all over the world, people are watching this movie because it is done in authentic Jamaican Creole.
I read an article earlier today where one guy said, I'm going to watch this movie 10 times because I didn't understand. The first 2 times I didn't understand a word that Bob said, but I knew he said something profound. So he said he's going to watch it until he learns exactly what he said. So I'm going to leave with this light note. So Mikey's in a class, and the teacher said, Michael, that is, what is the plural of foot? And Mikey jumped up and said, teacher, that is very easy. The plural of the word foot is feet. So, oh, beautiful, Mikey. I mean, that's just really profound. Now, would you be kind enough as to use the word feet in a sentence? Mikey said, oh, come on, Miss Brown. When Maxine teeth my pencil, me just go feet. That is all out. So he used the word feet.
Well, you know where your homework is going to be? Without looking it up, what is the plural of mangoes? Have a wonderful evening.
The rest is up to the audience to figure that out. Take care. We'll talk again next week, my brother.
All good, Paul.
Yeah,
all
man,
good.
Take care. All the best.
Keep the vibes going. Keep the vibes going.
For real.